But I do feel that once we enter the womb, there's a different awareness that needs to happen and needs to take place. And that is why I've got a small little snippet here. Don't be fuzzed by the context. The context is just a reminder for me in terms of what we're actually working with. I'm going to set it up here. So I hope I've created a little bit of context in terms of the fact that I do think that once we enter this space, it is a sacred space. And it's so special because we can't see what's happening. I personally love neurodevelopment as a field of study because there are so many things that I can do once the child is born. Once we can see the developmental components and once we can see them reaching their milestones. But for this very sacred period, space, time, there's not a lot that we can do physically. In other words, we can't create a developmental program for a baby. We can't create all the things that I would normally create for a child when there's aspects around neurodevelopment. But what we can do is to create the awareness of the process that your small little baby is going through. And then also some aspects that you can do in order to potentially enhance their process. So I'm then just going to start with this presentation for us. Let me just get that up. There we go. Sorry, I've got so many screens up here at the moment. Karen, can you see anything?
Not yet. You started screen sharing, but then nothing came up yet.
Yeah, let me just get it. It's this one. And then there I go.
I can see it now.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah. So it's really important to understand, and I know all of you understand this at some level, and we often talk about this in terms of, you know, there's a miracle unfolding, but I think the extent of the miracle sometimes is too big for our own personal understanding. And we really start to get a glimpse of this once we start to understand that every single cell division is a miracle in and of itself. So if we think about it, there's this egg and there's this sperm, and then they combine and they come together and they become one. And then that little unit, it's perfect in its design. And then it starts to develop and it separates. So this is the first differentiation that takes place. And we will talk about differentiation often. And this first differentiation then creates two little cells. Now, this process is so delicate and needs to be so extremely precise, because from the first and the second and the fourth and the 8th and the 16th and the 32nd cells that develops, each and every process needs to be so precise, because if anything during that process goes wrong, then the consequence of that will be severe. So that is why this process, in my mind, is so absolutely precious and a miracle each and every time that it happens. And it's from these cells, from a single cell almost, that this little precious miracle appears in your lap, fully formed. And as Karen said right in the beginning, you know, we are praying for 10 toes and 10 fingers, but actually there's so much more than that actually is happening in the background. Because what is happening in the background is what ultimately would help your child or enable your child to function for the rest of their life. So it's crucial that the neurodevelopmental aspects fall in place, and that they fall in place accordingly to designed sequence. And I will talk about this specific designed sequence. So in general, when I talk about neurodevelopment, I often see parents or people's eyes glaze over, because it sounds as if it's such a vast topic and such a in-depth topic. And in a way it is, but it is also extremely simple. The design is simple, the understanding is simple, it's very precise. And in general, when I talk about neurodevelopment, I'm actually talking about the development of the brain and the spinal cord. So that is actually simple in that form. And two components that's really important is the fact that we are talking about structure and function. So obviously, in order for us to be able to have the function, like speaking, walking, crawling, seeing, hearing, thinking, those are functions. And in order for us to have the function, we need the structure. And those two are so closely interlinked with one another. So if I want optimal function, at the end of the day, I want optimal structure. So when we then dissect neurodevelopment a little bit further, then you will see that it's a very specific developmental sequence that relates to the function. And as the different brain structures then develop, so does the function itself as well. So here we are talking about neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and neurochemistry. So the part that I'll be speaking today or covering today is more in terms of the neuroanatomy. In other words, when does what happen? And it's important that you as a parent understand when these things happen, because a lot of emphasis is usually placed on the health of the mother, and the environment of the mother, and food and exercise. And I know that you've had lots of topics today around these things. And I know the last segment of today is around the nursery and how to create this chemical-free environment. Now, that is crucially important. But what I want to also then emphasize is not only is this important for the mother, the health of the mother, the movement of the mother, the food that she eats, but what that does ultimately in terms of this developmental sequence of the baby, and how that could potentially impact on the growth and development of the brain and the spinal cord. When I do my assessments with parents, I have a 21-page form that I ask parents to complete. And huge portion of that is actually what happened prior to conception. I want to know about the health of both the mother and the father, whether or not they've been in contact with any heavy metals, toxicities, a stressed environment, because anything that could potentially influence what I'll be seeing in terms of the child's neurodevelopmental component, I would like to know, because then we can start to mitigate some of those components. So I always talk to parents in terms of a timeline, because neurodevelopment, there's sort of like mechanisms that's at play. And one of these mechanisms is the relationship between time and maturation. So, and you will see the timeline and the maturation that's taking place as I'm taking you through this. So I'll always plot whatever I do in terms of neurodevelopment against a timeline. And in our conversation today, the timeline is obviously from conception up to birth. And I just need to create some awareness in terms of when you read material, it is important to understand where they are writing from. So if you're talking in terms of pregnancy timelines, then obviously the timeline starts from your last menstruation, and then you fall pregnant. So there's a 2-week segment there, and then they count roughly up to 42 weeks. Whereas from a neurodevelopmental perspective, when I talk to parents, I talk from the time of conception, which is then 0 to 40 weeks. And that is roughly, so when you read material, or when you listen to material, just understand that there might be a 2-week gap in between the writing due to the way in which we calculate. But in terms of our conversation here, I will also always work from 0, round 0, the Big Bang, when it happened, when conception happened, and that is my time frame. So whatever you are seeing here is from that time frame specifically. Okay, then I'm not going to talk to you about what you might find often on the internet. There's a lot of programs out there that will tell you, at this age, the fingers are formed, and at that age, the toes are formed, and then you see a nose, and then you see the sex of your child. Just know that the sex of your child is actually determined by the moment of conception. So it's always been there. In terms of what the father brought to this package, the X and the Y, and that's been there. You might just see it later. So I'm not going to talk to you about that. I'm going to talk to you about what happens, or when the different structures of the brain actually develop. Because I do believe, as much as parents and mothers visualize but the baby and the development of the baby, it could be so potent if you would know what structures of your brain, your baby's brain is actually developed, and visualizing those components, and being in the process of those structures actually developing. So as I said earlier, I'm going to take you through some of the mechanisms. There are many, many mechanisms in terms of neurodevelopment. But in terms of what we are going to talk about here today, neurodevelopment then basically starts with the birth and the differentiation of neurons. So remember the second slide I showed you, the single cell, and then that single cell divided into 2 cells, and then that divided into 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on. It's important to remember, or to understand, that those cells are generic cells. They are not a specific cell. And from those generic cells, we then develop a number of cells, and then those cells, which are generic, start to differentiate. And part of this might say, I'm going to now start to form the brain. And another part might say, or another cluster might say, I'm now going to form organs, the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, different organs. So neurodevelopment then actually starts when this cluster of cells differentiates itself from the other cells, and that is the birth of neurons. And I will speak to this a little bit later. It's actually fascinating when you think about it, and I'll actually show it in the next one. The migration of these cells then occurs. So cells don't start. So let me give you context. So say my visual cortex that's sitting right here at the back of my brain. I don't develop cells there. No. What happens is there's this cluster of cells that have decided, or in the programming, differentiated themselves from other cells, and then they migrate. They literally move from one place to the other place where they are needed. And then when they land where they are needed, they develop into the specific cells that's required at that specific spot. I think this is absolutely fascinating. In other words, they are not that specific cell when they start out. They move to the place, and then they take the form of that specific part where they find themselves at, and then also the function. And at this stage, they are still immature. In other words, they are small little neurons with the nucleus and a little bit of dendrites, but not really a lot, so that they are capable actually to move from one spot to the other spot. And only once they've sort of like reached their destination, they then grow axons. Now, an axon is that long arm that you see there, and that allows for additional dendrites to form. And that part there, right there, is myelination. So this is where we can then see the importance of what you as a mother, what you consume in your diet. So obviously, for neurodevelopment to take place, we need building blocks. So we need our amino acids, and we need the mother to be able to metabolize her amino acids, in other words, what she's consuming, in such a way that she can actually metabolize it into the building blocks for what her baby might need. And then also, additionally to that, the myelination, in other words, the omegas that she's consuming, because a baby will strip the mother of her amino acids. Because what happens in this whole process is the fact that the priority is the baby. So whatever nutrients are coming in will first be allocated to the development of the brain of the baby specifically, and then later on to the rest of the body. So it's very important, and I know that in this summit you have been talking about nutrition. So just understand, for us to build this healthy brain, we need the building blocks, and very specifically in this case, then our amino acids and our omegas. So once the neuron has migrated, it lands. Because it's landed now and it's at its place where it's going to stay and grow, it grows the axons, and through the axons we then have these terminal buds. In other words, these little end points at the neurons, and now we have the opportunity for synapses. In other words, now we can have communication from one neuron to the other neuron in terms of the neurochemical components. And here you will see the link between neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and neurochemistry. So first of all, we needed the anatomy, but part of the anatomy was then also to grow in such a way that we can have the synaptic buds, that we actually have the physical buds through which the neurochemistry is then released, so that we have the communication and thus the function. So here you have a slide, and here you can see the synapse. In other words, it's the two little end parts of the neurons at the dendrites, and there's a little opening there. We call that a cleft, and then over there, in there, we have the release of chemicals from one neuron to the other one. And then lastly, in our process of neurodevelopment, we have the continual process of development. So a lot of parents ask me, so when does neurodevelopment stop? It doesn't stop. at all. So I almost see neurodevelopment from the point of conception, because those first cells will ultimately form our first neurons. And I see the end of neurodevelopment at the point of death. And there's lots of research that has actually indicated that we continue to grow neurons and neural pathways up to the point of death. So in terms of what's happening then, or in this slide here is what we see, continual movement of the neurons, continual firing of the neurons, and then our neuroplasticity is our ability to continue to learn and to adapt to our environment. So it is a lifelong process. Okay, so I'm then going to also talk to you about other mechanisms. So, and I've already sort of like spoken about it. I've told you that there's a very specific sequence, and then the fact that the neurons will differentiate, it will go to a place, and then it will start a process there. So one of the basic mechanisms that we have in neurodevelopment is this concept about the concept of activity independent and activity dependent activities. So the activity independent mechanisms are generally believed to occur as hardwired processes. In other words, we can't affect it. It's the generic program. It's something that we can't really interfere with, except if you think about it, in terms of we still need to provide the building blocks for this process to take place. Okay, now a certain aspect of this mechanism is differentiation, which is, as I've said, some cells differentiating them from other cells, migration, as we've explained, and then axon guidance. And this is then totally independent of what you and I wanted to do. This just happens. And then the activity dependent happens the moment the axon reaches its target area, and now other things could come into play, like food, nutrition, sensory information, that type of thing. And I'm sure by now you've already noticed that this could potentially talk about things like nature and nurture, that old theory that we always sort of like come up against. And the nature component is the fact that we all develop in exactly the same way. There's no deviation from the plan. In other words, if the plan states we develop our medulla at, or the first cells of the medulla develops almost in the first, or starts to develop almost in the first week, then that is the plan. If it develops later, it means that there is a developmental delay, and then the rollout of that might be significant. So in other words, the plan is very, very specific. The nurture component is what we can affect in terms of our environment, our family, our food, our emotions, toxins, pollution, all of those aspects that could come and actually interfere in terms of the nature component. So very important then, the sequence of brain development is predetermined. We cannot interfere there. But, and this is the exciting part for me, even though this is so predetermined, no two brains are the same. It's like a finger thumbprint. It's as unique as your thumbprint. So in other words, and this is also what I like about neurodevelopment, it is so specific in its sequence that you can you can plot it, you can see how it should be, you can anticipate, you can and this is how I work with a lot of children, because the neurodevelopmental component is so well plotted that I can see exactly where things got derailed slightly, and if I bring it back on the path again, then we can work. And that's how I work with children, obviously outside of the womb. But whilst our inside, we just need to, be aware of this nature nurture component. Then the next thing to be aware of is this concept of neurolation. And this is the first neurons that actually develops, and that is roughly at 19 days after fertilization. And this speaks to the fact that our neurodevelopmental makeup is quite different than other organisms on our planet. You can just think about how our babies, their functionality compared to let's say a giraffe. So when a giraffe baby is born, within 20 minutes of that baby being born, it can get up, wobbly as it might be on those long legs, but it needs to get up, and within an hour it needs to be mobile and running with the herd, because if it's not able to do that, it is prey. Whereas a newborn baby does not have that capability, doesn't have that functionality. So this slide just really speaks to the more complex the function, the longer the developmental process. And also then the longer that we need to be aware of the fact that this process needs support and actually needs this nature-nurture component. And it also helps us to understand what needs to be in place. So I've made some slides for you in terms of the different components. And this one is, let me just see slightly, it's at 25 days. Sorry, I'm in my own view. So 25 days, we already see that we've got a hindbrain, a midbrain, and a forebrain. Now, this white little component that you are seeing here is the area where the spinal disc actually started. So everything starts from a spinal disc, and then we develop from the inside out, top to bottom. And that's another sequence that needs to be in place. And this sequence is extremely important in designing a individualized neurodevelopmental program. So when we see children afterwards and they have a developmental delay, we take note of the sequences. So the top down, inside out sequence is one of the ones that we really use. So in terms of what you are seeing here, the hindbrain would have developed first, then the midbrain, and then the forebrain. 35 days, there you will see this area is now changing. From the previous slide, it was white. Now it's changing because it's starting to form into the spinal cord. And here you will see the development actually starting to form this little organism, where the hindbrain is elongating, and it's starting to form those bulbs to create different segments in that bottom part of the brain. And this is the primitive part of the brain, extremely important in our automated activities. So breathing, heartbeat, sleep, all of those automated components. And also this is the part that they call the reptilian brain, where we don't really think about it, and it's very much linked to our survival. Then we get the midbrain component, and here we've got loads of relay stations from this hindbrain to the forebrain. And ultimately the forebrain there is the place where we will start to think. That is the area that will form into the cortex. So here you can see the spinal cord is starting to mature, and here you will start to see different segments of the hindbrain to form very specific components. Now, it is important when you look at these slides that at some point I might talk about in 1 week and then later on, because remember, things first start to develop and then they start to function. Things start to show up early, and only after they've reached a certain level of maturity, they will actually kickstart into the functioning component. So here again, you'll see how it's starting to develop, and then here you will see how the cerebral cortex has actually started to build up volume. And these folds are taking place so that we can ultimately then have our medulla, our pons, our cerebellum, which is crucial in our ability to function on Earth. And I will speak to that a little bit later. And then the midbrain. And then there we've got our cerebral hemispheres, our cortex. And then here you can see the volume of the brain, and all of that has actually started to roll up and fill in. And the midbrain is very nice, securely tucked into or underneath the cortex, with the hindbrain and the spinal cord there. And then the last component which will develop is then the folds. And the folds allows us to have volume in terms of neural networks. So a brain that does not have the folds, if I go back here, over there, you will see it's a smooth brain. So that means there's not that much capacity for there's not a lot of space for neural networks, whereas here we've got a lot of space for neural networks, and a lot of space. The more neural networks, obviously, the more capacity for communication. Okay, so that's just a picture for you to see the general development. And then I'm going to talk about the timeline. So different structures develop, as I've said, in this timeline. And it's really important to take note of where you are in your process as a mother, being pregnant, and your health during the development of these specific areas. So the first one then to develop is the medulla, as I've said, the medulla oblongata, that's sitting right at the bottom. And this part of the brain is responsible for our automatic functions, as I've said, and reflexes. Now, right at the end of today's talk, I will bring this together, because for a pregnant couple, this might not be that important, but it becomes important when you understand the consequence of this, or where it fits into your daily life, or where it will fit into your child's ability to function and go through the crucial developmental stages just after birth, because those first 12 months after birth is really, really important. And those developmental aspects rely on what's happening during this period. So your medulla oblongata is then responsible for your automatic functions, your reflexes, your fight and flight. That's why I say it's part of the reptilian brain. It's that survival mechanism. And then it's also important for some aspects of sensory integration. In other words, the information that's coming in through our eyes, our ears, our skin, our nose, and all of that. The next one to develop is our pons. Now, this is really, really important, because this one, a lot of parents will meet the pons when they have sleep issues with their children. And here, the different birthing methods could potentially influence or have an effect on the pons. So the pons is the bridge between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And it also regulates it's important in the regulation of the 12 cranial nerves, but very important, it is linked to our sleep center. And sometimes if, during a birthing process, if something happened with the head of the baby, they might have used forceps, or it might have been a birth in such a way that the head was slightly just pushed out of alignment, then the little atlas bone right at the tip of the spine might press against the pons and then press against the sleep area. And then you will find it difficult to get your child into a sleeping routine and sleeping pattern. So it's just important to have these little bits of information available when you are encountering those difficulties. Then the next one is the midbrain. This is a serious nerve relay station, and it's crucial for balance, coordination, and movement. Now, again, here in the womb, it plays a role, not that much. It will help the baby to start to move when the baby makes the movement, but it's crucial once we are out of the womb, because the womb is a water-based environment. So there's gravity is not really playing its part there. But the moment the baby is born, then we live against gravity, and we need these centers to be able to assist us to understand gravity and to understand our body and our body's response to gravity. So this part is really crucial in learning as well, because we need an understanding of 3 dimensions. And that comes from our vestibular system, which I'll also talk about. But it's the midbrain part that also helps us with our balance, coordination, and movement. And then also it's important to remember that movement structures the brain. So that's one of the crucial components, how we structure the brain, and why initial movement after birth is so important. When a baby rolls and sits and crawls and walks, and all of those developmental milestones are crucial for the brain to actually put the structures in place, one after the other, so that we can go to a higher level of cognition. And we can only go to a higher level of cognition once these underlying components are in play. Okay, so, and then we develop the cortex. Lastly, I always say it's the last frontier. So right here at 5 weeks, those initial structures then enlarge, and they form the final 5 structures, which is then the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain, the diencephalon, and the telencephalon. And the telencephalon is the one, sort of like the last place where the brain then starts to divide. And it's in this division that we then develop the right and the left hemisphere. And you can see it's actually fairly early on in this organism's development that we already have this right and left hemisphere and the development of those two. Okay, then at 6 weeks, we've got now the pons, the medulla, the cerebellum, and the thalamus are well differentiated with the limbic system and then also the cortex. And then we have the cranial nerves. Now, the cranial nerves are also extremely important, and I don't think people realize the importance of I know parents do realize the importance of selecting a birth process, but natural birth is so important for the stimulation of the 12 cranial nerves. It is in this process of having a little bit of pressure on the head and on the scalp that actually activates the cranial nerves to fully function. And it's the cranial nerves that serve all our sensory motor organisms. So in other words, our eyes, our ears, our tongue, our mouth, even deeper in our body, it's not only the sensory, because the vagus nerve goes down into the body and comes up with information. And it's the process of pressure, slight pressure on the brain, that actually kickstarts this. And I often see a lot of children with sensory motor components after birth. And when I ask them about the process of birth, then I get a lot of information there. Okay, and then at this stage, at 8 weeks, the embryonic disc, that was the first to develop. Remember, right in the beginning, I said this embryonic disc develops. It now develops into the spinal cord, and from here, we will actually see the development or the maturation of other organs. At 9 weeks, we've got our fetus, and then the spinal cord now is fully functioning and continues to develop. And we have a nice developed midbrain and hindbrain. Next up is this at 13 weeks. It's very important at this stage, the development of the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is our sensory relay station for our senses. So this is the part of the brain that modulates sensory information. In other words, either allowing too much information to come in or too little to come in. And this is where we have potentially, we see children with sensory integration aspects, because the thalamus is the one that allows it either in or not. Okay, then behind or linked to the thalamus is then the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is one of our most important parts of the brain. It sits right here at the bottom of the brain. It is the treasure chest of the brain, because this one is so linked to movement, memory, and other stuff as well, but movement specifically. And for our developing babies, movement is crucial in the womb, in terms of the type of movement that they can make there during the birthing process, but then very importantly, those first 12 months after birth, the type of movement they make really creates the building blocks for higher cognitive thinking, and I will discuss that with you later. Just now. So in terms of how this then fits and how it works, so I've taken you very quickly through all the different aspects of the brain that develops. But for you as a parent, how does this affect your child and your understanding of your child? So within the first month of conception or after conception, your child develops that which he would need for touch. 2 months after conception, taste, then smell, then the vestibular system. So these are our primitive senses by which we actually understand our world and through which we learn. We don't learn by other means of our senses. So how touch is developed, how taste, smell is developed, and the vestibular, how those four are actually developed, will create the mechanisms through which we learn and understand our world. Now, as a mother, it's extremely important to know that from 4 months onwards, it's very important to move, and the type of movement that you make is extremely important. Because the vestibular system is that little organism or organ in the inner ear. And it's got 3 semicircular canals, one on this plane, one on that plane, and one on that plane. So we need movement on 3 dimensions. And I know that you would have had a segment on yoga. I'm sure you would have had a segment on yoga, and specifically the movement of the mother. It's not only important for you and your health and your well-being, it's crucial to your baby's development of their vestibular system, so that the fluid, because those semicircular canals are hollow tubes, there's carbonated crystals inside, and every time you move your head, or me now with my vestibular, if I move my head in the 3 dimensions, those crystals will move and they will send information to my brain as to where I am in space in relation to gravity. Because the baby don't have that space, it needs the mother to make certain movements so that it can have the experience of the movement of the vestibular system. And these building blocks then ultimately create what we need for later functioning. And I'm going to take you through them right now. So I've got a new timeline here. Right at the bottom, you will see conception, and then from conception, you will see birth. Now that is sort of like the first component. And in that period of being pregnant, your baby actually moves through the stages of reflex development. Now, these are primitive reflexes. So all babies are born with primitive reflexes. They should have their primitive reflexes. And these primitive reflexes help the baby in utero. It helps the baby during birth, very, very important. As an example, the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, that is that neck reflex that if you move your head, this arm will extend. And if you move your head this way, that arm will extend. Now, during a birthing process, a natural birth process, when the head has emerged, there's a slight movement of the head, and that movement of the head will move the shoulders, which will move the arms and help the baby actually in its last stage of the birthing process. And then the reflexes play a role up to 1 year after birth. And if everything has taken place the way it should have taken place, then the reflexes will be suppressed and the next phase will start to become more prominent. And that is the sensory motor system, or the sensory motor components. Now, it doesn't mean that there was no sensory motor prior to this. It cannot be further from the truth. The sensory motor system, remember, develops right from the start, actually. 1 month, touch, taste, smell, vestibular. But it's the sensory motor system requires a reflex system to be intact. And then we can start to interpret information that comes in, and we can make sense of it so that we can have a functional output. And once the sensory motor system is nice and fully developed, we can start to expect neurocognition to take place. In other words, our ability to think, make sense, read, write, and all of those things. And then later on, those will actually contribute to critical thinking and executive functions. So in other words, what I'm telling you is that the process in utero actually contributes to our ability for critical thinking and executive functions. And if we are aware of each stage and each step of neurodevelopment, we can actually influence it in such a way that there's optimal growth and development for your child. So that is neurodevelopment in a nutshell, Karen. I don't know if there's any questions. I know it was very technical.
It was absolutely brilliant. Honestly, Beulah, that was so amazing. And I learned so much from it. So thank you so much. And so many points that for me as a midwife are so crucial to put in those words, especially from a neurodevelopmental aspect. And one of them, there's a couple, but the one I want to start with is about those 12 cranial nerves that are stimulated during birth, because so often in my birth preparation classes, people are worried that the process of birth hurts the baby. Or hurts the baby's head, especially because sometimes the baby's head does come out a funny shape. So it's natural to assume that it's bad or it's hurt the baby. So knowing from a neurodevelopmental aspect how important the process of birth is, and also that whole vestibular system, how they're designed, you know, as a midwife, we talk about the rotation and descent of the baby and the mechanism of birth and how that's all connected. It's amazing.
I didn't even speak about that. It's brilliant. I mean, the design always blows me. So you need a strong vestibular system for the baby to know where to turn to. Otherwise, it wouldn't know what is up and what is down. So it wouldn't know how to move. So that's why the vestibular system, not why, I mean, I can't tell why, but the logic sense is then it starts to develop at the age at 4 months. Then it needs the mother to move to create the awareness, but so that by the time it's time for birth, it is fully developed so that it knows how to turn to be in a head first position. And then when I have children that's breech or did not turn, then in my work, then I would assist the child to develop their vestibular system, because it might have been that portion did not develop the way we want it, and there's ways to work with it. I mean, it's movement based. So there's in neurodevelopment, there's always good news. It can always develop. So yeah, and then just in terms of what you've mentioned, birth is a natural process. It has been designed the way it's been designed. So we might think that the pressure on the head is too much. We need it. We need it to stimulate and kickstart and send a message to the brain that's go time, you know. And go time means now all the systems needs to kick in, you know, the visual, the auditory, they are working prior to birth, but now they need to work at a different level. As an example, touch is developed in a wet environment in the utero. The moment the baby is born, it needs to adapt, and the adaptation must be quick, because then the baby functions in a dry environment and in an unprotected environment. In other words, Now there will be clothes touching the skin, and all sorts of new sensory information will be coming in. And the brain needs the message that it's go time and it's working in a different way. The birth process also helps to suppress some of the primitive reflexes that we don't need anymore, like that the reflex that keeps the baby in that tucked in fetus position, that's a reflex. And the birth process then registers in the brain that the baby can uncurl, because there's no space in utero to uncurl. So the whole birth process is actually a device, in my mind, to kickstart neurodevelopment to the next level.
So is what you're saying about the touch and coming from that wet environment to the dry environment, is part of that the process of passing through the birth canal, which is essentially a dry environment compared to being in the amniotic sac, and then coming onto the mom's skin to skin? Is that part of the sensory change?
Yeah, it's part of it's definitely part of the sensory change, but the cranial nerves is the cluster of nerves that actually send information from our outside world to the brain itself. And there's massive changes that takes place during the birthing process so that it can start to interpret a new set of information, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
And obviously it's a process. It's little by little, and as we develop it, it grows. Yes. But it is the signal for the brain to function out of the womb. Birth is the signal that triggers the brain to function out of the womb.
There's so much supporting evidence of the importance of natural birth, which is not to say that cesarean section is wrong. We know that there are definitely incidences where cesarean section is a life-saving procedure. So this is by no means talking against the cesarean, but just about the importance of the process of natural birth. And one is what you've just spoken about now. You brought in so many important aspects. And the second one, we haven't spoken or even touched on today, but will definitely be coming up in future talks, is of the microbiome. So
yes, oh yes, I mean that is magic right there. That is nature at its best. How that microbiome is actually transferred from the mother to the baby, and again setting the baby up to digest.
Yes. Before we carry on, we're definitely getting some questions here, so lots of thank yous.
Pleasure.
Tammy Reed, I'm going to start at the top one. Thank you so much for your question. How would one help neurodevelopment after C-section? And then Charlene, can neurodevelopment be rectified? Oh, hang on a minute.
Yes, yeah. So I love that last question. So when I started in my private practice, as we all do, I started on a different route, and I didn't like pathology, because sometimes when a person, it's like, and then I discovered neurodevelopment. And the reason why I love neurodevelopment is there's always room for improvement. That is the concept of neurodevelopment, even if it's from this to this. So in terms of the question about the cesarean section, it's just important for us. We know what is preferable. We also do understand that sometimes something happens and we need to have that cesarean section. It might be that you select to have one. It's important just for us to know. And then to understand that there might be processes that we need to undergo, and we sort of like don't see this initially, but slightly later in terms of crawling. And then if your child is not crawling, or if there's difficulties with sensory processing information, then definitely there are neurodevelopmental activities that we then give to babies and to toddlers and older children and adults to overcome these little, I don't want to say glitches, but we just bring it back on track.
So Charlene's asking if a gentle cesarean where the baby allows baby to emerge slowly to mimic the movement through the birth canal, which is kind of what we're trying to introduce into the hospital where the C-section rate is so incredibly high. Does that help? Would that make any difference based on what you've shared with us?
It would definitely help. I mean, in terms of a birth, even a natural birth, we don't want a too quick natural birth as well. So even in that, we want the process so that the brain can actually start. So just think about it for a moment. The baby is protected in the womb. Temperature is just right. There's no sensory onslaught. And then in a moment's notice, there's light, sound, action, camera roll. And the baby actually the brain cannot adapt that quickly. That's why we need the slow birthing process. So if you're lucky enough to have a slow cesarean process, it will definitely help with the brain's ability to start to adapt to its changing environment. And then I think the circumstances outside of the womb, in terms of, if you can manipulate your environment, not to have those bright lights, not to have a lot of the things that we sometimes do have in a theater, or just be conscious of the sensory process that your baby is going through. I think that is actually most important. And then follow your instinct, hatches down, close to the skin, soft noise, just be aware of this very harsh environment that some of our babies need to enter. And if we can make that slightly less harsh, then it helps the brain to integrate, because it needs to integrate new information.
Yeah, and I love that you're bringing a neuro aspect to that. It's not just about having soft light for the purpose of making a beautiful environment, which is part of that, but how that environment impacts the birth experience, both for the mother and for the baby.
Yes, yeah. And I think parents need to follow their instinct. They want to then close in and close down. And just think of this from your baby's perspective. Totally protected, totally secure, totally surrounded with just the right temperature, just the right sound, just the right light, very, very protected. And then what you bring them into, and then to do it slowly, to bring in the sensory, slow integration, so that the neurons can actually build. Because each time something new is introduced, pathways needs to build to integrate it.
Oh, so much here to uncover. And there's another question, but I want to go to the ones that are here before I ask my question. And Kara's asking, is or was there a lack of neurodevelopment if one has a colicky baby, or is that related to something else?
Yeah, colicky, it could be, but I would almost look at food first.
Mother's food.
Pardon? Mother's food, yeah. Baby's food, yeah. Digestion and that. I wouldn't necessarily ascribe it to hardcore neurodevelopment. I will probably just put it more towards physiology, if that makes sense.
It does. And actually, Cara, we will definitely do something on colic, because that is a topic all on its own. And there's lots of aspects to look at. But I'm really glad that we had the neuro aspects to bring to that. But certainly there's lots of other things that we would look at in terms of colic. Thank you so much. And then Megan has got a question. Besides working on the vestibular system, what are the other neurodevelopmental issues you would encounter with a baby born with a C-section via C-section versus natural birth?
Definitely sensory motor.
Okay.
Because remember, the cranial nerves governs the sensory information. So we sometimes do see children with sensory sensitivities like touch sensitivity, smell, taste, sound sensitivities, because the thalamus is the one that regulates that, but it's also then the cranial nerves that brings the information in. So I sometimes do see the sensory profile of children being more sensitive. They respond to the environment. Very important also is then reflexes. We often see children with retained primitive reflexes after the age of 1, which then could potentially, remember, these are like building blocks. We have the reflex system that is there for survival, like the sucking reflex, survival. And the moment children can then start to think to suck, the sucking reflex will diminish, and now the child chooses to suck, as an example. But the reflexes are there to build the pathways for the next, and then the next, and then the next. And if we don't have the natural process, then some of those primitive reflexes are not inhibited. If they are not inhibited, then higher cortical regions can't kick in, because the brain is designed in such a way that only one is in charge. It's either the higher parts or the lower parts. Reflexes resides in the lower parts, and if we've not built the higher parts, the lower parts won't let go. So in older children or toddlers, we see children with impulse control difficulties, if those reflexes weren't inhibited. So reflexes, sensory motor, and then the developmental sequence. In other words, when they roll, sit, crawl, what's those intervals? And it's usually at 3-month intervals.
Sure. Okay. One of the other things that came up for me was you mentioned something about that small little bone at the base that can sometimes be impacted, in the birth process, and how that can impact sleep. Can you talk a little bit more into that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a chiro, so I'm just from my understanding. But sometimes during the birth process, when there's a slight misalignment of the head, then the atlas bone gets misaligned, and then it presses against the pons, and the pons is your sleeping area. So then it won't matter what method you use to help a baby to sleep. Then no method will help.
Well, isn't that why we say it's so important that babies have a chiro, that not adjustment, but that balancing so soon after birth, and what a difference it makes.
Exactly. Because the birthing process is quite, it's a fragile spine. They've never had to endure the movement ever to go through a birthing process. It's a new movement for them. But then it's very important to go to the correct chiro, and to go to a chiro that understands, that works with small babies. Yeah.
Well, we have the correct chiro right here with us.
Fantastic.
We do. So that's fantastic. But actually, in speaking about that, and in terms of the movements, I know that one of my favorite parts, I think, of all things, when I'm attending a birth, is watching the rotation, if I can see it, the rotation of the baby's head. And that could be as the baby's head is emerging, and then once the head is emerged, how the baby's head will naturally restitute to go in line with the shoulders, and then how those shoulders move. And baby has not attended a class, they haven't read any of the books, and yet they know exactly what to do. It's a reflex, and it's so beautiful to watch. It is my absolute favorite part of birth.
Yeah, and that's the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. Now, so that's the one, if the baby moves slightly, that shoulder will move. And because the shoulder moves, it helps the baby emerge. Now, if that reflex is not suppressed, then you will see a child in classroom. It's so cute, actually. And they will turn to their friend, hello, and this arm will go.
Say that, do that again, because I came on. Just show that again.
So they might say hello, and then this arm will go. Okay. Because it's a reflex. Other reflexes, if you tilt your head, your feet, your legs will extend. So it's so important that the reflexes are inhibited. It's like a little puppet marionette. And that is the importance of knowing your developmental sequence. And if any part of that sequence did not happen for whatever reason, I mean, it might be that the mother was bedridden after 4 months. She had to be in bed, so she didn't have her movement. So the baby didn't develop his vestibular system. The most important part for us is to know. Once we know that, we can work with the vestibular system.
Just hang on a sec.
The same with other things, you know, if we understand the movement sequence and some part has not fallen into place, then we put it in place by following the sequence. That's the magic of neurodevelopment.
Absolute magic. Now we also have a question from Cassandra. Can chemical imbalance happen in the womb?
Is she talking what it would be nice if she can be more specific, and I'm now going to be more cautious in my answers as well, because I don't want to give medical answers without full history. But let me answer it from a different perspective. I specifically ask about toxicity prior to birth, because it affects the cells. Remember, we always work with neurochemistry, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. We cannot get away from that. And chemicals can be in any form. So neurochemical would be that which we produce, but then neurotoxins would be those that we can actually get from our environment. And I think your last speaker is talking about creating a green nursery. Am I right?
She is indeed. But the reason that we're carrying on over time is because she's missing an action at the moment.
Oh boy. Okay, so let me then talk about, so let me then talk about that. So neurotoxins are toxins or chemicals that can bypass the blood-brain barrier. In other words, the blood-brain barrier is a chemical barrier that inhibits other chemicals to actually go from the body into the brain. Mercury is one of those chemicals or neurotoxins that can actually cross over the blood-brain barrier. So we need to be aware of potential chemicals that we get in contact with, and then we also need to understand that the baby's brain is way more susceptible to neurotoxins than an adult's brain, and that is why it is so important to look after yourself prior to conception, male or female. And I know a lot of people say yes, but males produce sperm and they don't. The neurotoxins are still in the cells. Females obviously carry their eggs throughout life, so it is as important, but males often think that they don't need to look at neurotoxins prior to conception. And then anything that you are in contact with during the pregnancy period, and then small babies and young toddlers after birth, because they're closer to the ground. Things like new carpets, as an example, with formaldehyde that they often put in the underfelt of carpets. Because a baby crawls on a carpet, it's so important to make sure that your environment is toxin-free. So yeah, that is the short, long answer to the chemical imbalance. But I think that Cassandra probably asked about neurochemicals, so I'm not quite sure.
I'm not
Karen?
sure actually, Cassandra, she hasn't come back to give any more detail about that.
Okay.
So I'm not sure. And Beulah, honestly, we have gone way over time, and I can't thank you enough for that.
No, it's a
I
pleasure.
could carry on for another hour because all of this stuff is just absolutely fascinating. And it really isn't something that is covered in traditional birth preparation classes or any form of pregnancy preparation, in fact. And that's why I'm so glad to have you part of this, because it is so vital. And I think we've just seen, just in the course of 1 hour, what an impact it is, and how much it will help just in understanding it. And now she has come back and she said, yes, neuro.
Yeah, so it would be important for me to understand exactly, because obviously the mother's neurochemical components plays a role, and then the baby obviously develops their neuro chemicals from what you consume, and a lot of people don't understand that. Neurotransmitters are derived from amino acids. And in order for us to be able to produce the variety of neurochemicals, we need to consume a variety of amino acids. I'm reluctant to answer more than that.
Oh, I know. It's so difficult without the background information, and also because
Yes.
there's so many aspects of your talk today that have got another whole field. I mean,
Yes, I mean, I can, yeah. So, yeah. Well, she's welcome to contact me personally if there is a question around that. And then, Karen, perhaps it's important also to tell your listeners that we will be developing a program in next year, only January. There's no capacity now to take parents through the week-on-week process in utero, to know also what's happening. I think it's crucially important to know the different developmental phases that your baby is going through in utero, and then the process after birth.
Yes, I'm very, very, very excited about that. So as Beulah said, we're going to be developing a program which will literally take you almost the way she's done it now, with a timeline through the week-by-week development of your baby's brain and all of the aspects that are concerned with that. And one of the things that I found really fascinating that I didn't actually know, so thank you for that, was the 2-week difference, from conception and from the last menstrual period. So as a midwife, I'm always looking at the last menstrual period. And to know that for you as a neurodevelopmental, that you are looking at it from conception.
There's nothing to track. If from a neurodevelopmental point of view, we can only track neurodevelopment once there's neurons to track.
Exactly. Makes sense.
Yes. So structure informs form. Function. Sorry. Structure informs function. So once the structure is there, we can work.
Yes. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit through the program that you're going to be developing, and just explain to everyone how what it's going to look like?
Yes, well, it's very much in line with the due day club. So just as mothers are due in certain months, developmental processes are also due in certain months. In terms of the first component, it will be a 9-month process, and as we've already discussed, once a week release, because early on there are a lot of things that's happening. And if I believe that as much as we use visualization for good pregnancy and good birthing, we can also use visualization in conjunction with our child's development. I mean, how wonderful would it not be to focus on your child's vestibular system as your child is forming their vestibular system, but then also to understand how you can actually influence aspects of your development. Again, like the vestibular, it's important to then know that after 4 months, your movement is crucial to your baby's vestibular development, and then also to assist parents if say the mother is bedridden, what can she do during that period where we know movement is important, but she can't move? What do we do now? So it is a process by which we will then take the parents through the developmental phases. There will be a portion on birth itself and how birth affects neurodevelopment. And then the next phase after that, the second component, would be the first year after birth, because that is really crucial. And there's lots of things that we can do. And I always say early intervention is best. So, you know, if for example, there has been a cesarean section, there are things that we can do to help, to assist.
I love that. And as you said, that's exactly what neuro is about, is making change. And that's what neurodevelopment is about, is that we can develop that at neuroplasticity.
Exactly. That's why I love it.
So, yes, yes.
And I love it because the secret is in the formation. I don't have to conjure up a program. I just have to follow the sequence. I've spoken to when you were out, I don't know whether you heard it. I've spoken to the audience about the fact that when I do a neurodevelopmental assessment, I always ask about health conditions prior to conception. In terms of smoking, alcohol, the use of narcotics or anything like that, general health, stress, because stress obviously releases neurochemicals as well, and then our environment. In other words, do you work in a factory? Do you inhale, potentially inhale a lot of smoke? Secondary smoke is important to understand. The paint we use, does it, and I know a lot of paint have actually been discontinued, so lead in paint is not that, we don't see that often anymore. But do you live in an old house? Do you live in a house with old water pipes? Do you renovate, or have you renovated whilst you are waiting for the baby and creating this nursery? Because in renovations, we sometimes do sand old paint with lead in. There's so much to talk about. As I've said, carpets, make sure that the carpets that you install does not have formaldehyde, or they sometimes use a type of pesticide in the underfelt to deter insects and ants and things like that. So what type of underfelt do they use in your carpeting? Those are the quickest things that I can think about, Karen.